The Green Party is rising in the polls and their membership has exploded. The Greens now have 100,000 members, up from 60,000 in March. The membership surge was, of course, driven by people joining the party to vote for Zach Polansky as party leader, and then people joining after he won that leadership election. And Polansky celebrated with a video to Twitter.
This is it. We have done it. I can announce we have just passed 100,000 members. That's over 30,000 new members since I became leader. This is a real moment, both for the Green Party and, more importantly, for our country. People need to know that there is a real opposition. We will challenge this failing Labour government and we will take the fight to reform. So if you want a party that will tackle inequality, fund the National Health Service, put investment into our communities and make the case for a positive, hopeful politics based in community and solidarity, now is the moment to join the Green Party.
Of course, for people wanting a vehicle to the left of Labour, the Greens are not the only option. Zara Sultana and Jeremy Corbyn both spoke at the World Transformed Festival in Manchester over the weekend, and where they tried to present an image of unity after initial splits in your party. And speaking to Turn Left Media, this is how Zara Sultana explained how the party, now known as your party, would be different from the Greens.
We had 800,000 people who registered an interest. Those 800,000 people haven't gone anywhere and they are still watching us cautiously, and we have a job to rebuild trust and get them to join up as members of your party. We will work with the Greens where we have shared interests, and one of those is obviously defeating Nigel Farage and stopping him from becoming Prime Minister. But we have to be honest, there are differences between us and the Green Party. We are an explicitly socialist party. We should have a policy, and I hope members pass this, that we should withdraw from NATO because it is an imperialist war machine, whereas the Greens on their website say that NATO has an important role in maintaining security for its member states. If we look at NATO's track record, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, endless wars have made the world less safe. So we will have a NATO withdrawal position, an anti-NATO position. And also when it comes to Israel, there's no way that our party can support having diplomatic relations with a genocidal apartheid state. And so as I said in Paris at the weekend, every ambassador should be expelled, every embassy should be shut down, because there's no going back to a normal relationship with a genocidal apartheid state.
Helena, what do you think about this? I mean, you're a Green member, so I suppose you can't claim to be sort of like a neutral sort of figure here. I'm a member of neither, but I mean, also I don't claim to be neutral when it comes to this. I suppose I found the idea of like NATO membership being the sort of key dividing line a little bit like, how many people in the public care about NATO membership? And most people want to remain a member of it. So I feel like the idea that there's now this competition between these two left-wing parties who are encouraging each other to take positions which are essentially quite unpopular among the rest of the public seems like a slightly funny way to go about beating Nigel Farage. I don't know where you stand on this.
Never been a fan of NATO, just as most socialists. I've read all of the history, Operation Gladio, etc., etc. Not a NATO stan. But fundamentally, at a time of political crisis internally in this country, and geopolitical crisis, especially given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there is no real appetite in the public for re-examining a relationship with NATO. And given that most people's direct concerns in this country are about a cost of living crisis, whilst I don't think anybody who's on the left of politics, on the social end of politics, has any explicit support for NATO, I think there are a lot of people, and I am one of those included, who thinks that a re-examining of this relationship now as a forefront of a political prospectus for potential government is not one that is going to speak to the concerns of voters, other than to pique their concern over the security concerns that they have, that they believe NATO protects. Trying to have this conversation with members of the public who fundamentally see NATO as a force, as a bulwark against Russian aggression, when they're scared about what's going to happen with Russian aggression in Europe, despite the fact that many of us would make those claims or would find those claims unfounded, insofar as they would see the NATO aggression, NATO expansion has led to more destabilization than has it led to security, is not a conversation that's going to be easy to have or easy to explain. Whereas having a NATO position, which is, well, this is the consensus, we don't want to leave just yet, and if we do say and we should reform it to make it more pro-peace, for example, of course, very little example of being able to make NATO pro-peace in the long run anyway, but fundamentally, that's a way of being able to sidestep the NATO issue when most people are concerned about their bills. They're concerned about the cost of living. They're concerned about climate breakdown. These things are on the front of voters' concerns rather than our relationship with NATO. And so, given that Jeremy Corbyn ran on two political manifestos that both maintained things like NATO membership and a nuclear deterrent, for example, having those conversations now seems like something we should be doing later. Whilst I'm not going to be concerned with your party saying that they want to be explicitly anti-NATO, it's a position that I personally would share. I think that a pragmatic view that wants to ensure that we maximise the amount of people that can be brought into a potential electoral coalition for a left-wing party makes more sense to be doing what Zach's saying, which is fundamentally that whilst we don't have any current plans to remove ourselves from NATO, in a time of geopolitical instability, which is being spearheaded not only from the East, but of course has been driven by the West for a very long time and is currently being driven by a maniac president who says he wants to annex Greenland and potentially wanted to invade Panama. Having that person in control of our military operations and basically have control of access to the nuclear weapons that we have currently anyway doesn't seem to be a way of ensuring long-term security when we could be forging actual defensive partnerships with European neighbours rather than being a yoke into American unipolar imperialism. But I don't think that's a conversation many people in the public want to be having. Treating it as a settled issue and focusing on the concerns of the people that we want to win over is much easier. And I think that we've seen the kind of simple messaging of lower bills, fund the NHS, nationalise the water companies is a much easier sell to disinterested members of the public than let's rethink our entire geopolitical situation, which of course we want to do here on the left. But fundamentally, to be able to do that, you need to have access to the levers of office, which will take a broad coalition. I think another issue which I think will mean that your party will have a smaller potential number of voters willing to come across or willing to be convinced of the party's prospectus for government is the European Union. Again, I'm not a fan of the European Union, and the failure of Brexit is actually a failure to take advantage of the benefits, such as access to more monetary sovereignty, control over things like how much deficit that we have, access to monetary financing of government deficits, and better trade policy, and indeed more access to things like nationalisation and less competition laws restricting the state's involvement in the economy. But of course, none of the neoliberal parties that were going to actually get access to government, a lot of the structures of the economy in terms of what the UK government is happy to do, were never going to make use of those things anyway. And again, in a time of geopolitical instability, at a time of international entropy in terms of what's happening, being part of a large political bloc, a large diplomatic and democratic political bloc, is going to be useful in defending us against the real enemy, which is international, supranational corporations that have more power than any single government is able to actually leverage, which I think is the biggest argument for joining the European Union, which is, again, a very large plurality position, not just amongst the kind of the broader kind of liberal left, but just amongst the general public and politically disinterested people who see Brexit as fundamentally a giant failure. And whilst I understand that I don't see your party having a specific position on this, although you'd think they would be most likely anti-EU like most socialists would be, as it's fundamentally a free trade bloc, I think the Green Party's position of wanting to forge better relationships at time of recording is more palatable to a wider electorate. But to make it less explicitly socialist, almost certainly, and it's something that I have my concerns with in terms of the actual fundamentals of the policy. But again, like you can't really have everything that you want in terms of government. And when you look at the actual policy prospectus, right, like, are you willing to concede on these certain issues on the kind of the side of policy to broadly get an economic populist prospectus to government actually in office to be able to change the public's material conditions so you can then have those further conversations about things that are more structural and more kind of radical in terms of the way it changes the kind of historic nature of how this country has functioned outside of the economy, I think that would be much easier. It'll be much easier to convince people of changing our relationship with international trade, of changing our relationship with NATO and geopolitics. Once you've got into government off the back of solving the issues of the right here and right now that every working class country and this person can feel, which is that their bills are too high, their wages are too low, and they are alienated from production in every single possible way that Marx envisioned 200 years ago. I think this is the fundamental problem that is going to be found with the split between the two parties, is that whilst one is looking for purity, not necessarily purity, right, but is looking for something that is in its essence, that represents everything that socialism has to offer, there is a kind of more incrementalist approach from the Green Party that, again, I think has more electoral success potentially. But if you're trying to spread a socialist message, having a different angle from another political party, having a broad spectrum of tactics, both electoral and an organizational one that your party offers, where they are speaking to people within their communities and trying to change minds on the ground. Fundamentally, having that plurality of methods can only be a good thing as long as when it comes to the actual brass tacks of electoralism, they come to some form of agreement, which, fingers crossed, from what I've seen so far, from what Jeremy, Zach, Sarah, and all the others have said, seems like it is on the cards. Everyone seems happy to work together, and that fundamentally is the key point that I like to see.
Yeah, although that's what because I thought sort of Zara was in another point suggesting that sort of NATO was a red line. Although maybe it's a red line for joining your party, and if you're not fussed about NATO, you can join the Greens, and then you can just be in an electoral alliance at the next general election. Who knows?